The Shadowrun core rulebook is 500 pages long. That's a lot for anybody to take in. The good news is this though, you don't need to know it all at once. It should go without saying that if you want to GM this game, you'll need to know everything from the player's video. Go watch that if you haven't yet. I'll wait. Just pause this and open it in another window or something. You done? Anyways, in a nutshell, there's 2 keys to effectively running Shadowrun. The first and most important is this: you don't need to use everything. This is especially true if both you and your players are new to the game. The less you take on at the beginning, the easier it will be. So if you have a group of players that always seem to play the same sort of class as one another, this would actually be a fairly easy transition for you. You would only then need to learn how one of the archetypes works. Which brings me to my next point. Know what to know. If you've got 3 players, 2 are playing Street Samurai and the 3rd is a Decker, there is not much point to bringing a lot of magic into the game. Learn the basics for the Street Sams and some of how decking works, and everything else is pretty much an as-you-see-fit deal. But only as long as you see fit does not mean everything must be used in equal measure immediately. Using everything at once is not an effective way of learning things. Since we have established that not everything needs to be used at once, the next reasonable question is this: how would you introduce new elements as the game goes along? One option is to have the player characters just develop into that on their own. If a Street Samurai decides they want to start taking up decking, then there isn't much problem. All they need to do is invest in a cyber deck and start raising the right skills. Magic is where things get a little tricky though, since your character can either use magic or not. It's something that's decided at character creation. Characters can't suddenly find themselves with the ability to sling spells. In light of this, one option is just to let the players make a new character. The problem with this solution is that a player may be emotionally invested in their character, or more likely, they like how their current character is written up and don't want to slog through character creation again at the GM's behest. If you're savvy, you've probably noticed I'm leading up to something with how many solutions I'm presenting and then shooting down, so I'll just cut to the chase. Contacts. Contacts are NPCs of similar power to the players, and if there's any gaps within the player character's repertoire, they're a fantastic way for both the player and the GM to fill them in. For example, let's say our 2 Street Sam and Decker team from earlier is now having to deal with creatures that can only be harmed by magic, the very thing they lack. If one of them has a mage contact, they suddenly have a means of dealing with such a threat, which means the players get to keep their characters, and you don't have to grossly break the rules of the game. Bear in mind though, one of the themes of this game is that everything has a price, even calling on a friend for help. And this is where this benefits you as a GM. You now have another story hook for the players. How will they repay this favor? And what happens if they refuse? Contacts aren't exactly a silver bullet solution though. Now you, the GM, have to make this character. So you know now not to include everything all at once, and how to gradually introduce things. Good stuff to know for handling a game with a particularly massive set of rules like Shadowrun. What I want to talk about next is designing scenarios for Shadowrun. While I was writing for a website called The Game Master's Game Table, I wrote an article about Shadowrun. I described it as a game full of over-the-top violence, which was certainly how I ran it. The owner of the site criticized the outlook of that game. He admitted that while the game is certainly one that lends itself to violence, it doesn't necessarily have to be all about violence. Some of the articles he wrote about Shadowrun, which was a favorite topic of his, included how to make the game seem less like an armed robbery simulator. The advice he gave was that threats and actually causing harm don't have to be the only way to get things done in Shadowrun. If the players decide they want to do something like bribe a guard or secretary to keep quiet, let them, as long as they aren't stupid, ridiculous, or cheap about it. Basically, if the players come up with something clever that circumvents a combat encounter you had planned, let them. Do this especially since combat can take a really long time to resolve in this game. Shadowrun is the sort of game where being somewhat detailed in your preparations could encourage creative solutions from the players. If you can't be bothered to spend time in advance of a game plotting out a session, here's another thing to consider. Not everybody would fight to the death. Shadowrun is the kind of game where the more damage you take, the smaller your dice pools become, and the less likely you are to succeed. A death spiral, if you will. With that in mind, standing and fighting becomes difficult as time moves on. Even in a bleak world, there are still some people who wouldn't throw their lives away so easily. So sometimes, wounding is all a player might need to do to rout antagonistic NPCs. After taking a good hit or two, they may decide to run away. Or if the players take out the leader of a group of enemies first, the rest may decide that fighting further isn't worth it. So at that point, continuing combat would then be up to the players. Here's a few final things to consider. If you really want to ease your way into this game, there's quick start rules available, complete with pre-made characters and a simple pre-made scenario. All told, it's around 30 pages or so, and most of that I already covered in the player's video. Speaking of the player's video, Chummer 5a. It's good for players and even better for GMs if you need to make NPCs, such as contacts for the players. If you want to just jump in and play the game, Chummer 5a will make that all the easier for all parties involved. Also, Shadowrun has some random generators as well. The ones you can find online are for older editions though, so you probably don't want to use any mechanics or stat blocks they do. There's also a few in the rulebook as well, and that'll give you plenty of ideas regarding where to start. And my final piece of advice is this. There's a lot of splat books for Shadowrun, so once you get the hang of things in the core book, there's plenty more for you to branch out into. To reiterate, the most important thing is to take it slow. You don't need to know everything all at once, you don't need to use everything all at once. But once you get a grip on things, there's plenty more you can add in. You know, just like Dungeons and Dragons. So, with all that said, I'm Aaron Dershadel, and I'll see you in the shadows, Chummer. Thanks for watching. If you found this video useful, there's a button you can click to let the entire internet know. And remember, using only one source when you're doing research on a subject is a fantastic way to wind up incredibly biased. So don't just take my word for everything, there's plenty of other people talking about Shadowrun on the internet. Or better yet, read the book for yourself and play it for yourself.